Should we bring this up? I guess we have to. So this just happened. We just found out that Charlie Kirk got shot.
It's f***ing awful.
And is he dead?
Joe Rogan just dropped some serious questions about something that honestly a lot of people have been whispering about, but nobody's really saying out loud. We're talking about Charlie Kirk and a shooting incident that doesn't quite add up, according to Joe, and honestly, a lot of other people who've been looking into this. All right, so first things first, for those of you who might not be completely caught up, let me give you the quick background here. Charlie Kirk, the conservative political activist and founder of Turning Point USA, was reportedly involved in a shooting incident. Now, the official story that came out initially painted a pretty straightforward picture. But here's where things get interesting. And this is what caught Joe Rogan's attention. On a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe started questioning some of the details that were being reported. And when Joe Rogan starts questioning something, millions of people are going to start paying attention. The man has one of the biggest podcasts on the planet, and he's known for not just accepting the mainstream narrative at face value. So let's talk about what Joe actually said, because this is important. During his podcast, Joe was talking with his guest, and look, Joe does this thing where he thinks out loud, right? He's processing information in real time, which is part of why people love his show. Joe pointed out several things that seemed off to him about the official narrative. First, he talked about the timeline. According to the report, certain things happened in a certain order, but when you actually break down that timeline, Joe's questioning whether it's even physically possible for events to have unfolded that way. He also raised questions about the witnesses. Who saw what? When did they see it? And here's the kicker. Why do some of the witness statements seem to contradict each other? Joe's known for being detail-oriented when something catches his interest, and this definitely caught his interest. Now, Joe wasn't saying this definitely didn't happen the way they said. He was more like, hey, can we talk about these inconsistencies? Because they don't make sense to me. And honestly, that's a fair question to ask. Let's break down what the official story actually is so we're all on the same page. According to initial reports, the incident occurred at a specific location during what was supposed to be a routine event. The official narrative states that Charlie Kirk was present when shots were fired, and the situation was handled by security and law enforcement who were on the scene. The mainstream media coverage focused heavily on certain aspects of the story: the heroism of the security personnel, the quick response time, and the fact that Kirk was unharmed. All of that sounds great on paper, right? But here's what Joe Rogan picked up on, and what a lot of independent journalists and regular people online have been discussing. When you start looking at the details that are provided in the official story, and then you look at the details that aren't provided, you start seeing some gaps. For example, what about the security camera footage? In today's world, especially at events where high-profile political figures are present, there are cameras everywhere. So where's that footage? Why hasn't it been released to help clarify what actually happened? This is where things get really interesting, and this is what Joe Rogan spent a good chunk of time discussing. Inconsistency number 1. The timeline doesn't add up. Multiple news sources reported slightly different times for when the incident occurred. Now, you might say, okay, that's just sloppy journalism. Fair point. But when you have official statements from law enforcement also giving different times, that's when you have to raise an eyebrow. Inconsistency number 2. The witness accounts are all over the place. Some witnesses said they heard 3 shots. Others said 5. Some said the shots came from one direction, others said a different direction. Now look, in any chaotic situation, witness accounts can vary. That's normal. But the variations here are pretty significant. Inconsistency number 3, and this is the one Joe really hammered on, is the lack of physical evidence being shown to the public. Where are the bullet casings? Where's the damage from the shots? Where are the forensic reports? In most cases like this, at least some of this information would be made public, especially when there's so much public interest. Joe made a really good point when he said something like, look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but when things don't add up, I ask questions. That's what we should all be doing. Now, here's where the story takes another interesting turn. The media's response to Joe Rogan raising these questions has been, well, let's just say it's been telling. Instead of addressing the actual questions Joe raised, the inconsistencies in the timeline, the varying witness accounts, the lack of evidence being presented, many mainstream media outlets went straight to attacking Joe himself. They called him a conspiracy theorist. They said he was spreading misinformation. They accused him of being irresponsible with his massive platform. But here's the thing. Very few of them actually addressed the specific questions he was asking. And this is something Joe himself has talked about before. He said that when you ask legitimate questions and the response is to attack you personally, rather than answer the questions, that's usually a red flag. It means someone doesn't want those questions being asked. Some independent media outlets and journalists have actually started doing their own digging into the story. And guess what? They're finding the same inconsistencies that Joe pointed out. They're asking the same questions. They're requesting the same evidence. The difference is they don't have a platform with millions of listeners, so they're not getting the same pushback. But the fact that multiple people independently are arriving at the same questions, that's significant. Now, it's important to include Charlie Kirk's perspective on all of this. After all, he was supposedly at the center of this incident. Kirk has made public statements about what happened. He's thanked law enforcement and security personnel for their quick response. He's talked about how grateful he is to be safe. He's positioned himself as someone who survived a scary situation. But here's what's interesting, and this is something else Joe Rogan pointed out. Kirk has been pretty vague about specific details. When pressed about the exact sequence of events about what he personally saw and heard, his responses have been somewhat general. Now, you could argue that this is just trauma. When you go through something traumatic, sometimes you don't remember all the details clearly, or you don't want to relive the experience by talking about it in detail. That's completely understandable and totally valid. But Joe's point is that for someone who's usually very articulate and very specific about things, Kirk is a professional communicator after all. The lack of specific details is noteworthy. It doesn't necessarily mean anything nefarious, but it's worth noting. Kirk also hasn't released any personal footage or photos from the incident. In an age where everyone has a smartphone and is recording everything, especially at political events, the absence of personal documentation is interesting. All right, so let's address the elephant in the room. Whenever someone questions an official narrative, they get labeled a conspiracy theorist. And look, sometimes conspiracy theories are just that. Theories without solid evidence. But here's the thing Joe Rogan emphasized, and I think it's worth repeating. Asking questions doesn't make you a conspiracy theorist. Wanting evidence doesn't make you a conspiracy theorist. Being skeptical when a story doesn't add up doesn't make you a conspiracy theorist. The term conspiracy theory has become a way to shut down legitimate questions. It's a thought-terminating cliche. Someone says, that's just a conspiracy theory, and suddenly people are afraid to ask questions because they don't want to be labeled. But throughout history, there have been plenty of times when the conspiracy theorists turned out to be right. Watergate was dismissed as a conspiracy theory until it wasn't. The NSA mass surveillance program was called a conspiracy theory until Edward Snowden proved it was real. The list goes on. Joe's point, and it's a good one, is that we should always be willing to ask questions, especially when something doesn't make sense. That's not being a conspiracy theorist, that's being a critical thinker. Now, does that mean every conspiracy theory is true? Of course not. But it means we shouldn't dismiss questions just because someone slaps a label on them. We can't ignore the political dimension of this story either. Charlie Kirk is a prominent conservative voice. Joe Rogan, while he considers himself more libertarian or centrist, has been increasingly critical of mainstream narratives and has been labeled as right-leaning by some media outlets. So when Joe questions a story involving Charlie Kirk, some people immediately assume it's political. They think Joe's defending Kirk because they're both on the same side politically. But if you actually listen to what Joe said, he's not defending anyone. He's questioning the official story because the official story has holes in it. He'd do the same thing regardless of who was involved. And he has done the same thing in the past with incidents involving people across the political spectrum. The problem is, we live in such a polarized time that everything gets viewed through a political lens. If you question something involving a conservative, you must be a conservative. If you question something involving a liberal, you must be a liberal. It's exhausting, and it prevents us from having honest conversations about what actually happened. Joe made a great point when he said something along the lines of, "I don't care what your politics are. I care about what's true, and that should be the standard we all hold ourselves to." Now, it's not just Joe Rogan and random people on the internet who are questioning this narrative. Some actual experts have weighed in as well. Forensic experts who've looked at the available information have pointed out that certain details don't match what you'd typically expect in a shooting incident. Ballistics experts have raised questions about the reported trajectory of the shots versus where people were positioned. Security professionals have questioned why certain protocols weren't followed, or why specific security measures that should have been in place apparently weren't. Now, to be fair, none of these experts have access to all the information. They're working with publicly available details, which are limited, but the fact that professionals in relevant fields are also seeing red flags, that adds weight to the questions being raised. One former law enforcement officer who spoke anonymously to an independent news outlet said that in his 20-plus years of experience, something about this case just doesn't smell right. He couldn't point to one specific thing, but the overall picture didn't match his experience with similar incidents. Another security expert noted that the response time, as reported, would be almost impossibly fast unless security personnel had advanced knowledge that something was going to happen. Now, that could mean they were just really good at their jobs and really on alert. Or it could mean, well, it could mean other things. Here's something else Joe Rogan touched on that's really important. Why isn't there more investigation into this? When a shooting occurs, especially one involving a prominent public figure, there's usually a thorough investigation. Not just by law enforcement, but also by journalists, by independent investigators, sometimes even by government oversight committees. But in this case, there seems to be a remarkable lack of curiosity from the institutions that would normally be all over something like this. Major news networks covered the initial story, but how many of them have done follow-up reporting? How many have sent investigative journalists to dig deeper? How many have filed Freedom of Information Act requests to get access to police reports, 911 calls, or other official documentation? The answer is very few. And that's weird. Joe pointed out that if this happened to almost any other public figure, the media would be all over it. They'd be investigating every angle. They'd be interviewing everyone who was within a mile of the incident. They'd be creating detailed timelines and graphics showing exactly what happened and when. The lack of that kind of coverage is conspicuous in its absence. And when Joe raised this point on his podcast, you could tell it genuinely bothered him. Because for someone who values truth and transparency, the apparent lack of interest in getting to the truth is frustrating. Of course, as soon as Joe Rogan started questioning this narrative, social media exploded. And I mean, exploded. On Twitter, the hashtags related to this started trending immediately. You had people on one side saying, "Finally, someone with a big platform is asking the questions we've been asking." And you had people on the other side saying, "Joe Rogan is being irresponsible and spreading conspiracy theories." Reddit threads about this got thousands of comments within hours. People were sharing screenshots of news articles highlighting contradictions. Others were trying to create timelines based on available information and finding that things didn't line up. YouTube videos analyzing Joe's comments started popping up everywhere. Some were supportive, some were critical, but they all had one thing in common: massive view counts. People are clearly interested in this story. Facebook groups dedicated to discussing political events had heated debates about whether Joe was right to raise these questions, or whether he was causing harm by casting doubt on the official narrative. The interesting thing is, even among people who initially accepted the official story, many started having second thoughts once they heard Joe's questions and started looking into the details themselves. That's the power of asking good questions. It gets people thinking. What do you think about all this? Do you think Joe Rogan is right to question the official narrative? Or do you think he's being irresponsible? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this video interesting, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos.